In this video, we will take a look at Lambda functions. Lambda functions are like regular functions, but they do not have a name, so we cannot call upon them like we can with a regular function. And for this reason, not having a name, they are also called anonymous functions. Lambda functions can take in as many arguments as required, but only have a single line expression, and it's assumed whatever it executes will get returned, which actually means we do not have to use the return keyword with our Lambda functions, and a Lambda function evaluates and returns only a single expression. So what's the use case for Lambda functions? Why do we need Lambda functions? The use case for Lambda functions is that a Lambda function can be passed into other functions. So a function can take in a Lambda function as an input or return a Lambda function as an output. Or you can even do both of them. Map and filter are two common examples, and they can be used in conjunction with an iterable. So we will have a look at examples of these, but iterables, by the way, are strings, lists, dictionaries, tuples, and so on. Basically a series of items and values. And you can use Lambda functions with other functions, or for functions that you only need to run once in your program without the need for a full function definition. Or another example would be for creating an event handler for Tkinter widgets, such as buttons, for example, when you are creating a graphical user interface. And this is the syntax for a Lambda function. So Lambda itself is a keyword, which is saying what follows it is an anonymous function. So Lambda, and then it's followed by arguments with a colon, and then the expression. And we can see the description of the syntax. So Lambda is a keyword for defining the function. Then the argument or the arguments is a placeholder for a variable or variables that will be used to hold the value you want to pass into the function expression. And a Lambda function can have multiple arguments depending on your requirements. And then anything following the colon will be the expression. And the expression is the code itself you want to execute in the Lambda function. So we can see the regular function on the left hand side, and it's specified and it starts with the def keyword followed by the function name. On the right hand side, although we have put it in my_lf, a variable, it doesn't have to go into a variable, it can be specified on its own. So Lambda, the arguments, colon, followed by the expression. And it doesn't have a name, so how do we call upon the function? So one example is to use it inside a variable like I've done here, my_lf, and then followed by the Lambda code. Then we can call upon the variable name. But this in fact is like a regular function then, because we've specified a variable name. A Lambda function doesn't usually have a name. So Lambda function in its own works in conjunction with other functions, which we will have a look at in PyCharm in the demo. Now looking at two functions in particular, which is the Python filter function and the map function, which are two functions built into Python. We can use both of these in conjunction with other functions, and in particular Lambda functions. So looking at the filter function, as the name of the function implies, the filter function does some filtering. It can filter through an iterable and is able to select or extract items using a given condition. And the syntax for a filter function is the word filter, and then in parentheses we pass in two parameters. So it can be a function, it can be a regular function or a Lambda function, and then followed by the iterable. The iterable can be a list, dictionary, tuple, and so on. And then the other function is the map function, which executes a specific function on each item in an iterable, like a list, dictionary, tuple, etc. And this may actually sound like a for loop. So it behaves similar to a for loop, but without having to use a for loop, of course. So we will have a look at the map function as well. And the syntax is very similar to the filter function. So you use the name of the function, map, and then in parentheses you pass in two parameters, and that's a function, could be a regular function or a Lambda function, and then the iterable. So with all that being said, let's have a look at how Lambda functions work in PyCharm. So I've logged into PyCharm and we are going to have a look at Lambda functions. So how do we use a Lambda function? And one way we can do this is the way we create a variable. So we assign it a name. We can assign them to a variable, but then there's no point of using a Lambda function, because then we can use a regular function instead. But we can do it this way anyway. So for example, with a regular function, we can create some code, 2 times x, so 2 times whatever value we pass. So if we passed the value 5 in a regular function called my_function, and we returned the result, and if we run the file, we get the result, which is 10. Now using a Lambda function to write the exact same thing, we would do So we start off with the keyword lambda, followed by the input value. So lambda as the keyword, then x colon 2 times x. Now, because we have this lambda function that has no name, we cannot run it because it doesn't have a name. So how do we call it? So the one thing we can do is run it by giving it a variable. So my underscore lf for lambda function equals, and then the code, the expression. Then we can print it. So print my underscore lf. And now let's pass in the value of x, which will be 5. So because we've assigned it to this variable, we can run the variable. So let's run the file and we can see we get 10. So it's the same thing as the one above, but this time we've passed it into a variable and then we've passed in the value and then we get the same result. But typically you wouldn't pass it into a variable. Then it's like a regular function. We've given it a name. So we may as well use a regular function instead. So now we'll have a look at the typical use cases of lambda function, where they are actually used. And they're used in conjunction with other functions like the filter and map function. So let's have a look at the filter function first. And the filter function can filter through an iterable and is able to select or extract items using a given condition. So to start off with, let's create a list of numbers and assign it to a variable called my underscore list. I've just copied it from my notepad, so I'll paste it into PyCharm. Now let's extract all of the odd numbers from the list, and for this we will create a lambda function. So this is my lambda function using the modulus operator that will extract all of the odd numbers. The modulus operator, also known as the remainder operator, works on integer values and expressions and figures out the remainder when the first operand is divided by the second operand. So this is the lambda function. Now let's specify it as part of the filter function. So we can put this into parentheses and then specify our filter function. So filter. And if we remember, there's 2 parameters. So we are passing 2 things inside here. One is the lambda function, or it can even be a regular function, followed by the iterable. In our case, it's my underscore list. And then we will assign this to a variable called odd underscore numbers. And now we can print this to the console. So let's do print. And then we would say my odd numbers are, and to pass in the list keyword, followed by our variable odd underscore numbers. So let's run the file. I have made a mistake because my underscore list is in small and it's got a capital over here. So let's change that and run the file again. And odd numbers is not matching odd number, so we've missed the S. Let's run the file again, and this time it runs. So my odd numbers are 1, 3, 5, 7 and 9. So this is my lambda expression to filter out odd numbers, and then I've used it as part of the filter function, and the filter function takes in 2 parameters, and then we have assigned all of this to a variable called odd underscore numbers, and then we have printed this to the screen. We could have easily done this for even numbers as well. We could do this now by removing the exclamation mark, so not equals to, and using the double equal sign, so the equal operator, and then run the file again. This time it would filter the even numbers. So of course that should say even numbers are, and then we can see it's filtered out the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Let's change it back to odd numbers since the description is for odd numbers. My odd numbers are. Let's have a look at the map function now. So we can now see the use case of lambda functions and how they work to complement another function to do something. So the map function executes a specific function on each item in an iterable, similar to a for loop. So I'm going to create a really simple map function which would multiply my values within my tuple. So I've copied a tuple, let's paste it in. So I've got these values here, and then let's create my lambda function. So this is my lambda function. It's saying x multiply x. So whatever the value x is, it will multiply it by itself. So now the lambda function will be part of the map function. So it's map, and then in parentheses we have the lambda function, and then we would specify the iterable. So it's my underscore tuple that we would be running the lambda function on. Close the parentheses. Now let's assign the map function, which has the lambda function passed inside it and my underscore tuple. And we will assign this to a variable called multiple underscore values. And last but not least, let's print it to the console. So we pass in the list and then our actual variable multiply underscore values. So what this should give us is each value should be multiplied by itself. So 1 times 1, 10 times 10, 5 times 5, 20 times 20, and 4 times 4. So let's run the file. And we can see the results here. So 1 times 1 is 1, 10 times 10 is 100, 5 times 5 is 25, 20 times 20 is 400, and 4 times 4 is 16. Or since my tuple is a tuple, we could change this to a tuple. Let's run the file again. It gives us a tuple instead. So that's a high level overview of Lambda functions. So we can use Lambda functions with other functions, as we have just seen, with the map and the filter functions, and we can use them in other situations as well.